This episode of the Media Leader podcast was edited by our production partner, Trisonic. For a full range of audio, media buying, and creative services, including podcast production, check out trisonic.co.uk.
Advertisers, they don't see publishers, social media platforms in as different way as maybe the people sitting on the reverse end within the media industry.
Welcome to the Media Leader podcast. I'm Jack Benjamin. Last month, concerns around brand safety and the opaque nature of programmatic advertising flared up once again following a report from ad tech transparency startup Adalytics, which found that a huge number of big-name brands have been placing ads on a website that hosts a great deal of child sexual abuse material, also known as CSAM. It is far from the first time that brands have been in hot water for accidentally advertising against unsavory material online. One media strategist told me, in fact, that revelations of this type now come around every few months, leaving brands feeling constantly insecure with their online spend. But at the same time, brands haven't exactly been flocking to support trusted quality online publishers either. Despite research to the contrary, many brands are continuing to use harmful and imprecise keyword blocklist strategies for avoiding advertising against supposedly brand unsafe content on publisher websites. Do brands actually care about brand safety? And if they do, what steps can they take to make sure they're supporting quality media? Emily Roberts is head of digital at the Responsible Marketing Advisory, an independent marketing consultancy. She's also co-founder of the Women in Programmatic Network and an inaugural member of the Media Leaders Future 100 Club. Roberts is especially well-placed to unpack the latest Adalytics report, and we discussed whether brands are putting their money where their mouth is on brand safety, and she shared tips for how brands can avoid supporting harmful content online. This is that conversation. I hope you enjoy. Emily Roberts, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for having me.
You only recently joined the Responsible Marketing Advisory at the start of the year.
Yes.
Previously, you worked in programmatic roles at PwC, IAB Europe, also at the BBC and The Guardian, so across both publisher side and consultancy side, which is very cool. I'm curious how you first got into a career in programmatic and then what drew you to the RMA recently.
Yeah, of course. So quite a strange story, and people always ask, but essentially when I finished school, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, which is probably like the majority of the advertising industry. Yeah. And so I went to work for John Lewis, and I'd worked at the department store for quite a while, and then the Christmas ad came out, and it seemed like the whole store kind of sold out within the space of a week, and it really showed the impact of an ad firsthand.
And which Christmas ad was it?
It was the Penguin one, which is obviously always my favourite one. But it really showed how much of an impact advertising could have. And I thought, yeah, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So it's definitely not how I think most people fall into the advertising industry, but it's a quite an interesting one to see how firsthand of an impact it can be. And then essentially, the way I got into programmatic was I got an apprenticeship at Google. So 1,000 people interviewed and I managed to get one of the spots, which...
Congrats.
Yeah, to this day, I'm not really sure how. But essentially, while I was there for that 12 months, we always knew that we were never going to stay on. That was part of the deal. And so we had to figure out what we wanted to do. So I was in the YouTube sales team, and I was focused on essentially looking at YouTube ad sales and kind of growing that, which was really interesting. But there were other parts of the business that were also really growing. So the two other parts that I looked at were DeepMind at the time, and then DoubleClick, which is obviously now just within Google. And I spent time with both teams and decided that programmatic was the way to go instead of Gen AI.
Seemed like a really good career choice.
Yeah. Now I'm looking back and thinking, did I make the wrong decision? But at the time, it was really, really interesting. And it still obviously grows massively to this day as well.
And then why'd you join the RMA?
So I've always kind of moved companies because I've really believed in essentially what they're doing. I'm a great believer in whatever role I end up in, making a difference to the industry. And that's actually how I ended up at PwC. At the time, I was working for BBC News, heading up programmatic for EMEA. And when the study came out, it obviously came out and said that 51% of ad spend was only going to the publisher.
Right.
And I definitely felt that from the publisher side, right? Like these brands were penning in large amounts of money, and yet we were only receiving just slightly half of that revenue. And then the fact that 15% was unaccounted for, it was obviously a real challenge at the time. And so essentially, when the ISBA PwC study came, I felt like that had made a real difference in the industry, which is ultimately why I joined there. And then with RMA, definitely making an enormous difference. We specialise in sustainability, D&I, accessibility, but also digital, programmatic and social media, essentially making the industry a better place, which there's lots of stuff that can be done. But for instance, like 1/3 of adults are either audio or visually impaired in some way. And so that means that as brands, you could potentially be missing out on a massive amount of your audience. So ensuring ads are all accessible, for instance. So really, really interesting projects. And we're only 2 years old, and we're doing some amazing stuff already. So yeah, really excited to have joined there.
Very cool. Reflecting on your time at the BBC and The Guardian, you hinted a little bit at this, but do you think programmatic reliant ad models are sustainable for publishers when there is so much revenue perhaps not being given directly to publishers in that space?
Yeah, so I think I've done quite a few projects on this with a few of the news brands in the UK. There's definitely not I think a lot of news brands thought that the money that they were making in print back in the day was essentially going to equate to the same within digital. And that's just not been the case. Unfortunately, that money has essentially gone elsewhere, which is a real challenge for news brands. So when I was at the BBC during the pandemic, we had more people coming to us basically trying to understand what on earth was going on with the pandemic, especially in the first few weeks. And yet we were losing more money than we ever have been before. And so that kind of shows you essentially that polarization between people needed to find out what was going on in the world, but yet brands were really concerned about the brand safety around the articles we were running on. So it's a real challenge for publishers. They need to essentially make that revenue back somehow. And I've been working with a couple of publishers on changing their revenue models quite a bit. So around you either consent to your data being shared or you pay.
And the ICO's ruled that that's basically okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe not for Facebook though. That's kind of up in the air still.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think that's helped a lot. Obviously, if the user consents, then it means that they can, the publisher can show them personalized ads, and then it means that they can get more money, more revenue per user. But there's still a real challenge for publishers. And I think for advertisers, they don't see publishers' social media platforms in as different way as maybe the people sitting on the reverse end within the media industry.
I wanted to unpack this a little bit more. So the main topic I wanted to ask you today stems from a comment you made about polarization, a word that you've already used. It was in reference to the analytics report that I did an article on that you commented on, in which that report found huge swaths of major advertisers had been over the past 4 years placing ads on a website that hosts child sexual abuse material and other gross and unsavory imagery. And you argued that brands appeared to have polarized on brand safety. And I'm curious if you could unpack what that means for me.
Yeah, of course. So in 2017, I was actually at YouTube at the time, the sales teams have mentioned. And essentially on the Friday, the Times came to us and said, we've been doing loads of research on YouTube and we found that there are significant brands that are running on really inappropriate content and monetizing kind of harmful and really sensitive content. And they said, we're going to publish this article on Monday. And they did. And we essentially overnight lost a lot of brands. It's around 250 that's been published of the major brands across the world stopped basically running on YouTube. So this isn't an issue that's been going on for like the past 6 months. This is an issue that's been going on for a long time now. And I think YouTube was that kind of key driver in talking about brand safety and brand suitability. It was a significant turning point, essentially. So I think, unfortunately, when this Adalytics report came out the other day, a lot of people weren't surprised by it, which is a real shock in itself, right? And really interesting when you dig into the report, just how many of the large brands ended up running on content like that. And there's obviously a lot more to do there now. So, for instance, it's come out that that website was using ads.txt. The reseller was using sellers.json. And obviously, a lot of those major brands were using third-party verifiers. So all the things that essentially, when I work with major brands, I advise them to be using all these initiatives, industry initiatives, and kind of best practices. It shows you that you can still fall foul to those essentially running on that content. And I think one of the key is to essentially run on inclusion lists only, not just exclusion lists.
And why aren't brands necessarily running on inclusion lists if they are? I mean, I assume many are, but it sounds like maybe not enough are doing this if so many brands are ending up in unsavory places when they shouldn't be.
Yeah. So one example, so I was working with a large brand recently where they had a really, really strict inclusion list, and they felt really comfortable with kind of the brand safety and brand suitability across the web that they were running on. And essentially, me and my team went in as auditors to go in and check the content, and found that the agency had expanded the inclusion list. And so regardless of the fact that you might have a really strict list, things can always change. I think it's really important to have kind of checks in place to ensure things like that don't happen.
Why would the agency expand the inclusion list?
And so this is one of the big issues, I think, within programmatic. The argument is always scale. So essentially, you're running a large campaign. You need to hit certain KPIs. It's a performance-based campaign. And essentially, if the brand is not achieving their KPIs or they're not reaching enough people, then that will end up inevitably getting expanded. And that was one of the issues that I had when I worked publisher side, that somebody would run a campaign with us, but because they had so many brand safety blocks in place, like if you think of at the moment, you run on BBC News, you're blocking Trump, you're blocking like war, you're blocking a lot of the content. And so that's one of the challenges, which is why people then suddenly start to expand their inclusion lists because they're focused on their performance of the campaign.
But sorry, this doesn't make any sense to me, really, in the sense of if you care so much about brand safety that you're not even wanting to advertise against a quality, trusted publisher, which there's been lots of research done in the past year to suggest that that is a brand safe environment, regardless of whatever is being written about. You're so concerned in that sense that you're potentially harming the scale of the campaign, so you widen it, the number of websites you're wanting to be included on the other side of the campaign, as in allowing potentially for unsavory websites. That's what's happening? That doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, so I think that's part of the problem. And I think if you're running on hundreds of thousands of websites, so there are brands out there that all they care about is their KPIs. They just want to hit their KPIs.
Hundreds of thousands of websites.
And they're running on hundreds of thousands of websites. I consistently find this when I go in to speak with brands and look at how they're running their campaigns, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's on the open web. They're running on hundreds of thousands of YouTube channels. They're running on hundreds of thousands of websites. And this is a prime example of what happened, I think, with IBB.co, is if you were to look at all those URLs, look at hundreds of thousands of URLs, first of all, who has time for that? And that's why AI has become very reliant on kind of assessing those websites. But the problem is you still need manual checks. To most people, IBB.co doesn't stand out as a dodgy website when you look at the URL, right? If it's performing well.
And this is the website from the Adalytics report, to be clear.
Exactly. And also the volume of traffic per advertiser will be so tiny on that it'll probably be on the bottom of the list of that campaign. So it's not a priority. And so that's why these companies have obviously not found it. But the issue is, and when I was at PwC, we did a big study to understand, well, just how many URLs is the perfect amount. And we found that no more than 500.
Right.
Which you can manually go in and check, right? You can think of a whole load of premium publishers that URI will look at. And essentially, you're not then opening it to the whole of the open web. So inclusion lists are incredibly important. If those brands had strict inclusion lists that didn't include resellers, then it wouldn't have happened. But they relied on other elements, which I think are equally as important, but don't play the same role as an inclusion list. And if you think about how most people use the web, there's only a certain amount of sites we use, right, in any one day.
I can't imagine I've been to 100,000 websites in my life.
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. So it's about choosing those premium sites. The issue then is when you go into the more premium sites, you obviously pay more. It's like, I joked the other day, but it's like a bottle of wine. I could send you out to the shop and get me a bottle of wine. You could buy me the cheapest bottle of wine going. Yeah, you've achieved your goal of getting a bottle of wine, but it's probably going to be disgusting to drink,
well,
right?
I, as a drinker of cheap wine, actually, I'm perfectly fine with that. But it's different when I'm a brand trying to advertise and potentially running into a serious problem.
Yeah, exactly. And so that ultimately comes down to you have to pay more as a brand to ensure that you're running on premium inventory in a quality setting. And it's not just about brand safety. If you think about the amount of ads that run on certain websites, it's about attention and running in a premium quality page, for instance, as well.
Why not just buy direct with publishers? Why buy programmatically and open yourself up to an agency potentially messing with your inclusion list or expanding? Why take the risk? I guess if you're so concerned about brand safety that you're clearly going through quite a few hoops to make sure that you're not being on these unsavory websites.
Yeah, and the thing is, a lot of those brands, like premium publishers, would be very, very much up to having that conversation. If a large brand went to a premium publisher and said, "Hey, I'm looking to do a deal with you," then I'm sure that they would be very interested in doing that, right?
I'm sure publishers would want to do that.
But it then comes into play with trading deals. If you're Google, you're Facebook, the majority of agencies will have trading deals and they will have to hit those trading deals. Whereas if you're just a little news site, that might not have the scale that you want compared to Google's open web. You have to hit those trading deals. So it's a balance. I think definitely brands will start to see kind of a shift towards working with more premium publishers. I think, as you said, that's a big polarization between news brands losing an awful lot of money and the spend and growth of major platforms still increasing. So I used to, at PwC, run the IB ad spend study. And one thing we found each year, and this is kind of on the open web, the top 5 companies that are running in digital are still making double digits, and they have done in the last 20 years. They make up 80% of our entire digital advertising revenue, 5 companies. Wow. So if you can imagine how much money they're making versus the news brands still, it's a big difference. And as having worked for these news companies, we would have always been interested in large brands coming to us and making those deals with us instead of being reliant on the open web.
And keyword block listing for their own brand safety. Where did keyword blocklisting come? Why is this still a thing? I had Terry Hornsby on from Mantis. This was now quite some time ago, I think about a year ago since he was on the podcast, talking about how this is still an issue. I don't think there's been a lot of movement on it based off of Mantis' own research in terms of about half of articles related to the Super Bowl or Halloween are getting blocked still. Having these conversations. So why is this still a thing?
Yeah, and we had that, like, if you block the word COVID in the pandemic, chances are it's going to massively reduce your scale within a news brand. We had that issue all the time. We would set up brands with some of the premium publishers and they wouldn't be able to get their scale because they had the longest block list on news providers based off kind of what they were using on the open web. I think it's brands are very worried about running on content like what's happened in the Adalytics report, but that they are putting those keywords in. So, yeah, it's something that I think is historically been the right thing to do. But whether it's the right thing to do now, I think it comes down to specific URLs running on only.
What do you expect brands to actually do in reaction to the latest Adalytics report? Yeah,
well, so the reality is, and it's a pretty sad reality, this, like, the CSAM content that we've seen is increasing enormously year on year. And because of Gen AI, it's getting even worse. So Facebook reported that they removed 25 million pieces of content in Q4 of 2022 alone.
Jesus.
And that's just for child endangerment. So it's increasing to the level where the more you look into it, the more it's shocking. So this isn't going to go away anytime soon. It's definitely one of those things where, and Google writes a transparency report on it to show how much content they're taking down. Obviously, Facebook's taking enormous volumes of it down. But if you think, Gen AI is making this a whole lot worse, and actually the tools that are scanning this content are now finding it harder to because like face swapping is happening within Gen AI. So it's becoming incredibly complicated. I would hope that brands have learnt from this, that were called out on that report, and that they kind of speak to their ranges and agencies about how this has happened in the first place. Ensuring that you're only running, as I said, on premium content. I think having that third-party verification is still incredibly important.
Are those vendors still reliable, even despite the report?
Yeah, so, and they've come out and said that they can't essentially crawl every single URL before an ad is served. And the issue with that website is that they have URLs created constantly that are sharing images and then disappearing within 30 minutes. So for a double verifying IS, it's incredibly difficult to just continuously crawl the whole of the internet for that. But it's because it's very low volume traffic. And obviously they're prioritizing very high volume traffic sites first. So it shows that I'm going to say again, the inclusion lists are very important, but they definitely help with ad fraud, viewability, and brand safety as well, if used correctly. And it's always been kind of a best practice that we'd say to some of the major brands to use them to have clear benchmarks in place and flag anything that you see as slightly suspicious as well.
Do you think brands actually care about brand safety? Or are they just sort of saying it? Because it doesn't feel to me like they're necessarily acting as though they really care about brand safety. If they're avoiding spending a lot on trusted publishers, but spending kind of fairly openly on the open web, obviously there are mistakes that can get made, but also to bring up social media, as you've mentioned, platforms that are making active adjustments to content moderation strategies just in the past couple of weeks that have made it more likely for more harmful content to be on those platforms and not necessarily rolling that spend back.
Yeah. The social media platforms benefit from the fact the advertiser never sees what content they're run next to.
because it's different for every person. Like it's algorithm.
Yeah,
different.
Exactly. So if you actually saw the content that as an advertiser you were running next to, you probably might not want to run on those. But for instance, Facebook's, how they measure their like CPA and their general measurement, a lot of it is not MRC accredited like the rest of the industry. So essentially when an advertiser runs a campaign, the performance seems so much better on Facebook. For instance, we had a brand that essentially took their third-party verifier off completely, and the advertising campaign that they were running with Facebook 100% viewable, because it was in feed, it had to be 100% viewable. But that's not the case, right? Like there were ads at the bottom of the, I'd say, page, but it's unlimited scroll,
right,
but that were never viewed by the user. And so I do think the social media platforms get away with probably slightly more because of that. And so one of our advices was, no, you need to put that third-party verification back on because it's absolutely not 100% viewable. So I think the way that social media is compared to some of the premium publishers is very, very different. Like the BBC, The Guardian, we were under very strict like MRC accreditation when it came to measurement. So like an impression was an impression whether you're at the BBC, The Guardian, or a lot of the other premium publishers. Same with viewability. But when then it starts to change on the social media platforms and you're comparing like for like, you're actually not comparing like for like. So it's very complicated. I think there's a lot of work to do around education as well there. And I think the sheer volume of, for instance, YouTube channels, as I've said, or social media content that a brand is running next to just can't be manually reviewed. And so then it comes down to kind of a big reliance on the tech and the AI, which I think we do need more manual involvement.
Yeah, I was going to ask, because all of these platforms, if they were sitting here in this conversation, they would say, we've got fantastic brand safety and suitability tools. Advertisers can control exactly where they show up in our environment. I don't know whether or not I should trust that if I'm an advertiser, because you're relying on tech as opposed to an actual person checking every single ad because the scale is just so huge.
Yeah. So when I worked at YouTube, obviously I've seen both sides.
Yeah.
And essentially we would never ever say to a brand it's going to be 100% brand safe on YouTube. The sheer amount of volume of videos that are put up every second makes it impossible to know what is being put on there. Obviously, they've put a lot of measures in place now, and I think YouTube is one of the best for kind of brand safety measures. But if you had a premium, and we saw it with Logan Paul, premium YouTuber, a while back posting about like a suicide in a woods.
Yeah, I remember this was a couple of years ago.
Yeah. And his channel was deemed brand safe, and all of a sudden it really wasn't deemed brand safe. And YouTube would openly say that not all their content is brand safe, and obviously it's up to the advertiser's discretion. It's still technically a social media platform where anyone could upload anything. They do have a lot of checks in place, and they take down an awful lot of content, same as Facebook, but it's the sheer volume of content that's constantly being uploaded compared to The Guardian, like with their journalists writing a few articles a day. Like the volume is very different, and obviously for premium publishers, they're able to completely manage what's put up and what's not.
Right. I mean, to your point around the broader difficulty in moderating brand safety on the platforms, it's a couple of the platforms aren't necessarily even wanting to do this anymore, or making it actively worse in terms of brand safety, I would argue. I just wanted to point out 3 stories just from the past week or two that I think are relevant. One is, according to the Wall Street Journal, X is applying pressure on IPG to spend more money on its platform, even though they might not want to because of their political situation, where Musk, who owns X, is also a top White House official with the Trump administration, and they might be able to, stop that merger from going through. So there's essentially a platform taking an agency group hostage, which is, I think, a concern. That's not a reason to spend money with the platform. So that's one thing. And then in terms of the actual brand safety itself, TechCrunch reported that recommendation algorithms operated by X as well as TikTok showed extreme far-right political bias in Germany ahead of its election, which was Sunday the 23rd. We're recording this the Monday after. 78% of algorithmically recommended content on TikTok and 64% of such content on X was found to be supportive of the AfD party, even though the AfD only has about 20%. I think they want around 20% of the Bundestag.
I think what's really interesting and what's kind of quite strange in our industry is you're not just running an ad campaign anymore. If you're a large brand, you have an enormous responsibility about where you want that money to go. And at The Guardian, we would always talk about that. Like, fundamentally, if we didn't have ads, The Guardian just wouldn't exist. Yes, people subscribe, and obviously in some places like the US, people love to subscribe to The Guardian. But in the UK, we're a bit more stingy. So The Guardian has to rely a lot more on ads. And so because of that, brands need to kind of really think about where they're putting their money. Like, there's a lot of amazing investigative journalism pieces, like the Windrush scandal, which would have never happened without advertising, essentially.
I think to your point, is there a brand association not just with the content on a given platform or news organization that you want to be associated with, but with the organization itself? So, is it a brand safety issue to be advertising on X or TikTok or Meta, regardless of where you're showing up, just because someone can point to your brand and say, maybe you shouldn't be supporting these platforms anymore? Is that a concern that advertisers are actually facing, or is it not really something that people should be thinking about?
I think it depends on the advertiser. I think there's always going to be advertisers that don't really care where they're running to a degree and essentially just want to have a really great performance-based campaign, right? I say to a degree, no one should be running on sites that monetize what we've obviously uncovered with the Adalytics report. And so if you want to run on Twitter, like, that's up to you. And I think people know, like, the kind of content on Twitter. They know the kind of content on Facebook as well. But you still need those checks in place to ensure that as a brand, you're happy to run there.
Apart from your day job, I want to note you also co-founded the Women in Programmatic Network.
Yes.
But during the pandemic, I think?
Yeah. During the pandemic.
Yeah. So it's a nonprofit that works to celebrate women in programmatic advertising and ad tech. I'm curious, especially given some of the more recent topics around content moderation, brand safety, how especially that group of women is making sense of everything that's going on right now. Yeah.
It's been an interesting time recently, like starting a role in responsible marketing, and then obviously DEI initiatives getting scrapped in the US, which is a big part of what we do at RMA, and then obviously with the Women in Programmatic Network. But I do think, and I've had this question quite a lot in the last 6-7 weeks, I think there's a big difference between what's happening in the US and what's happening in Europe. Unfortunately, the US has always, in part, we've been really worried when we started the network and thought about going into the US about getting sued for being a women's network. There's a lot of people, unfortunately, in the US that argue that it's discriminatory against men and that they've actually sued women's networks in the US because that, yeah.
Oh, well, I'm not aware of that.
And it's predominantly in the US. So we've always been aware of that. We've been very cautious with launching in the US because of that. And obviously, that's why one of the reasons that our network is open to everybody. We want a really great conversation from everybody. Like, you can't have equality without having everybody in the room. But I also think in Europe, the kind of opposite's happening. And actually, more companies are focused on D&I than ever have been before, which is very exciting. And obviously with International Women's Day coming up, I feel like there's a lot more talk this year around International Women's Day, which is very exciting. But yeah, I mean, the reality is that what's happening in the US hasn't gone through the law yet. So it'll be interesting to see what happens when it does. But the brands that have essentially scrapped those initiatives, I don't know how interested they were in those initiatives in the first place, or whether it was a kind of more PR marketing thing. There's a lot of other brands as well in the US that are sticking with their DE&I initiatives, and they're going to push even more money. Like, I know a lot of companies are putting in like heads of inclusion in place, so it's actually done the opposite as well for some of the major brands, which is great to see.
Backlash to the backlash.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, well, the companies that have scrapped their DE&I initiatives, I don't know if they ever really cared about them in the first place.
A lot of those brands are media owners.
Yeah.
Whether they're social media companies or other types of brands. So how are brands that are wanting to spend on those platforms or with those media owners, how are they making sense of, well, we want to make sure that we're supporting things that we have committed to with regard to DEI, and yet we're also giving lots of our ad spend to companies that are explicitly not doing that anymore?
Yeah, so we're working with quite a few brands at the moment that are really focusing on DE&I. So whether that's like what I said before in terms of focusing on monetizing more of DE&I communities, being aware of the fact that if they run a campaign somewhere, that's going to really help a community potentially. And so certain brands are putting a lot of money into DE&I areas, owned and operated, the audiences as well, which is really exciting. So I think the brands that want to are going to carry on doing it, and the brands that haven't, hopefully this might change their mind and make them think about where their money is going and what difference they can make. Yeah, we'll see what happens in a few months.
Yeah. If you had to pick one particular issue that's going to be on the RMA's plate for the rest of the year going forward, what do you think that is that you think brands should really be tuned into thinking about if they want to be marketing responsibly?
Yeah, so obviously I'm biased as the head of digital. I will say digital. I think the Adalytics reports really shone a light of how much more needs to be done in digital, and explaining to people outside the industry about what's gone on recently. I think people are quite surprised at like how we haven't figured out that stuff. So definitely working with brands to ensure they're marketing responsibly, they're not running on this kind of content, is definitely one of my priorities. But there's a whole load, like sustainability, D&I is also going to be equally important as well this year.
Well, I'll have to have you back on to talk more about other issues. Emily, thank you so much for your time. It's been great.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Media Leader Podcast. Our executive producer is me, Jack Benjamin. Special thanks to our production partner, Trisonic. You can find all our episodes wherever you get your podcasts or on our website at themedialeader.co.uk. But do please remember to subscribe to be notified when we release our next episode. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at The Media Leader to receive daily coverage of all the biggest stories in media and advertising. From all of us at The Media Leader, I'm Jack Benjamin. See you next time.